This is a picture from our last physical event in Barcelona, just before the world kind of went upside down. And if you cast your minds back to March, say middle of March, the world was starting to change very dramatically. And I remember very distinctly on the 11th of March, I was meant to be traveling to HIMSS. Maybe some of the people on the conference were the same. And the governor announced the state of emergency. And then soon afterwards, HIMSS decided that it wasn't going to go ahead with a physical event. And, after kind of realizing I wasn't going to be getting on a long flight and staying at home, it really started to sink in. Well, what does this mean in terms of how we do business, and how are we going to do business if I'm stuck on this small island and can't see people face to face? And then also a lot of our business was really around physical events. We had one in Melbourne around this time last year. Actually, we do lots around the world. So, and little did we know back in March how much the world was going to change. And so over the course of that, our last kind of couple of months, we've set up a whole series of, we call them virtual lunches, to try and understand what's happening and to try and get a sense of what it means. And so what I want to do is just take a quick kind of spin of what we've learned so far. And as I said, I'd love to make it interactive. Let's start with the my screen is stuck. Let's start with the money and the good news. And the good news is the money continues to flow. This is Silicon Valley Bank's report. I know Lisa Sunan shared some stuff yesterday with you guys, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think there's a couple of interesting things here. First of all, that the first half of the year is almost equal to all of last year, and last year was a record year in terms of healthcare venture capital. And you can see some of the big deals there. So, compared to what's happening in a lot of other industries, it's good news. But I think it's probably too high level to actually be useful. If you're an entrepreneur in Australia, it's probably a bit too high level, because it's only if you can get access to that cash, and this is very much an American focus. And it's also focused on what's going in. So there's been lots of money going in for many, many years, rather than maybe what's coming out or what new health outcomes are being driven. So it's good news, I guess, at a very high level. But what we learned pretty quickly is that it's affected the industry in many different ways. And it's not really one industry at all. If you think about it, it's several different industries. And so, sorry, I'm having some technical problems here. Okay, so it was very interesting and I know, again, Lisa shared some of this kind of insight with you guys yesterday, but it really varies based on where you are, which part of the industry you live in. It's really affecting these stakeholders in very different ways. I was just on a call today with one of the leading health systems in the US, like one of the top 3, I guess, and they are just bleeding money right now. So very hard for them to no money to invest, just trying to cope with the crisis and trying to figure out. So it's a very hard to get any airtime to talk with them, never mind any money out of them. So this whole uncertainty for the health systems about claims getting repaid, just a very chaotic space, I guess, but a critical space. So seeing a huge amount of pressure there, and I know a lot of entrepreneurs are selling directly into health systems, so that's incredibly challenging. And I think that's pretty universal, although the financial impact can differ by geography a lot. I think we'll start to see other sort of longer term impacts as well. I mean, will you get so many people wanting to go into the profession and want to become healthcare professionals? And also, I suppose you guys have probably talked a lot about kind of, the impact around broader issues like wellness and mental health. But, I suppose what we're seeing is just huge pressure on the health systems and a lack of cash. And so So that's really tough. And then you have the payers who in the short term are actually, you know, most of them are getting a financial bounce out of this because they're not getting the expensive electives. Are seeing, certainly in the US, that employers are taking a different approach in terms of coverage and in certain cases waiving the co-pays. So very different picture with the payers. And in our experience, that's kind of opened, I suppose, forced them to think a lot more about what's possible around digital. They've been really laggards. We kind of go into that in a little bit more detail. Life sciences, I suppose, is a big bucket, and pharma and med device, I think, from our experience, are being impacted in different ways. And depending on which geography and depending on which therapeutic area they're in, it can have a very different impact. And also then in terms of whether they're on the trial side, on the research side, trying to work out the logistics around getting trials set up versus on the commercial side and supply. I mean, there's a huge variation. There's a huge variation by geography. There's a huge variation by kind of where in the life sciences chain you are, whether it's pharma or medical devices. And so, there's really there's no kind of one solution. But with our customers, we've seen an increase in terms of demand to try and understand what's going on in digital. So I guess that's good news, and it's kind of been positive for our business. They're all trying to figure out how to work with healthcare professionals, given that they won't be able to physically see them. And so that whole thing has just kind of really exacerbated the kind of pharma sales rep model, and that's put a huge amount of change in there. So I guess it's an opportunity, is also a bit of a threat. And I guess we're seeing then sort of more buy-in from groups that were previously skeptics. So a really mixed picture across those different areas. And then what I haven't layered in here is the kind of differences based on geography. So if you're focused on India versus Germany, for example, very different dynamics at play. And then obviously what it means in terms of digital health companies and entrepreneurs in terms of cash. And I guess you guys have probably spoken about that quite a bit already. What we've seen, I guess, this bottom line here is adoption, obviously, as everyone's working remotely, adoption of digital health by healthcare professionals and patients. And so there was, when it started first, people were saying, oh yeah, is that going to stick? And what we're hearing is, yes, there's a really strong feeling that we're never going back to the way we were, and that digital is going to play a continually important role. So I guess that's good news that it's here to stay. But I think it's still very early days in the cycle. And we're talking to some entrepreneurs, investors last week, and they were saying it's 1996 in terms of e-commerce for healthcare, right? Yeah. And so we're starting. And I guess the question is, well, why is it so hard, and why is it so complicated? And why is it taking so long to really, for the industry to adopt digital technology? And the way we think about it is that everyone talks about silos of data, which we think is a big issue, but I think there's silos of people as well. And for any of these solutions to really scale, you don't need to convince just one person or one group. You need to convince a whole village or a whole community. So you need to have the people who prescribe it, the people who use it, the people who pay for it, people who regulate it. I mean, there's just all of these people who can say no, and all these different stakeholder groups. And we think that's fundamentally the challenge that we have as an industry, is how do you get these different groups to align? And that's a kind of core focus for what HealthXL is about and why we exist. And what we've done up to recently is we've brought people together in meetings and spent days together and talk. But now we've realized that we have to obviously migrate that to a virtual environment. And since this kind of kicked in, we've run about 20 or 25 of these virtual lunches as a way of, and it's really been a bit of a blessing in disguise, because before, I've been trying to sell into the US for probably 15 years and trying to get folks to have a video call, which was a challenge. So people would say, I'll take a phone call, but the next time you're in Boston, come and see me. And now suddenly you can get to see them. They're open to doing Skypes and they're open to doing Zooms, etc. So we've tried to take that model and said, okay, if you look at some of the big areas of, the big opportunity areas, how do you bring leaders from those different parts of the industry together? And this is one of the lunches. And how do you get small groups of great people who are really passionate about trying to solve problems and put them together and try to move it forward? So this is what I'll go into now in a little bit more detail. It's kind of some of the stuff that we found having brought this. This is one group we brought together around social determinants of health and how to support the underserved and get paid while doing it. What I'll do is just kind of go through a little bit more detail of kind of how that works, kind of what HealthXL is doing, and then what we found as we've gone along. So this is it at a high level, and this is kind of the one sales slide, and I'll move off it quickly, Grace. So I just wanted to kind of give a position of what we're about. So on our platform, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's great to hear about how to actually get engaged with this. I think people are quite interested, so don't worry.
Yeah, cool. So we've built a platform which basically allows you to select areas, or we call them communities of interest. So we have things like social determinants of health and mental health and telehealth and digital therapeutics and these types of things. And so you can go in there and there's a lot of content which we curate, trying to get through all the hype and all the noise and say, like, who are the interesting companies and what's the maturity of this stuff and what's actually going on? And probably most importantly, who are the people? We're really trying to build this community who represent those different groups: payers, life sciences, health systems, entrepreneurs. Because if we don't get those folks together, then we will have what we've had for the last 10 years or 15 years, is these projects that just don't scale, because you're only getting a group of one part of the ecosystem together, and you need to get them all if we're going to get to scale. So we then take that and try to match people up, and it's always between 5 and 10, because it gets any bigger than that, you can't do it on Zoom, and any smaller, you probably haven't got all the right stakeholders together. And we go around and try to understand what their questions are and put this peer group together, and HealthXL curates it. And so it's just a Zoom call like this, but with a bunch of people. We try to break them down and get them to have a little bit of fun and then get into the meat of it. And then we go through kind of a series of questions with them and polls with them, to a bit like, I guess, what you're doing here, to try and understand what's actually going on. And then we collect that information across, for example, in digital therapeutics, we have a series of these groups, and so we can get that collective data together. So compare that to, going to HIMSS or going to JP Morgan, where everyone kind of runs around randomly, and it's kind of potluck whether you get to meet the right person. Certainly a very random process. So that's what we've been doing as a way of trying to really understand what's going on. And I guess this is the first point is, and it kind of goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago, that healthcare isn't one industry. It's actually many, billion-dollar markets all masquerading as one thing. I think that's a really important point, because people talk about healthcare, but it's actually, on the one hand, very local. On the other hand, you have all of these different parts of it. And so maybe to kind of show it in another aspect, and this is one of Lisa Sulin's slides that I've kind of modified a little bit, that probably, the easy thing to say is, who's your customer? The really hard thing to do is to figure it out. And time again, we work with organizations and individuals who have a great idea that makes sense for the whole system, but it's really unclear who's going to pay for it. And we say who is not like what group or what organization, but what title or what individual. And so that's that's fundamentally one of the biggest challenges. And so go back to trying to sell into health systems who have no money, who are bleeding money because of what's happened with COVID, and trying to sell them anything And even in the best of times before COVID, like if your solution didn't matter how good it was, if it wasn't taking significant cost out of the system, it's very unlikely that a CFO from a health system is going to approve it. So I think that's a really easy thing for me to say, but it's a really hard thing to figure out. And in many cases, you have these multiple parties who are involved. And as I say, healthcare is largely localized. So you go to each market. I know you wanted me to kind of give a flavor of some of the markets. If you go to each market, then there's a kind of different set of constituents in each one. It's very hard to get scale. So anyway, that's the probably preaching to the converted here, but that's what we see time again. But if we look at again, go back to kind of following the money, you've probably seen variations of this before. And so, US is twice as big as the next, they spend twice as much per person. So if you think about, the US market and the EU market being roughly similar in terms of the population size, they're spending twice as much, and that's without the complexity of, well, if I'm selling into the next market down here, Germany, system's probably going to have to be in German, or Sweden is going to have to be in Swedish, so actually trying to think about the European market, there's no kind of one European market. And so the smart thing, I think, is that a lot of entrepreneurs are focusing on the US market in terms of just that's where the money is, right? So what we've done over the last 3 months is try to dig into that a little bit more, and starting with the payers. And this is a report that we just released a couple of weeks ago, where we really tried to dig in and say, okay, what's actually going on in the US payer market? What are they? How are they working with digital health companies and innovators? And so, I mean, just to kind of take this at a high level, it's a very fragmented market. So you can see the biggest player. So if you take it that private is a little over half of the market, so 56%, that's on the left-hand side. And then you break that, come back across into the middle, you have of that 49 is an employer space, and then you break that back to the right-hand side to see some of the payer names that you may be familiar with. But of that, United is by far the biggest and still only accounts for 15% of that market. You can see the other numbers for the other folks. And then at the top, you have, a lot of the companies that we're hearing about kind of, day to day, the innovators in the spaces. So the Devoteds, the Bright Healths, the Oscars, all these new types of plans. And then along with, the kind of integrated systems like the UPMCs and the Kaiser Permanentes. So I've spent about 20 years going back and forth to the US and lived there. A couple of years ago, I was only, kind of on the ground that I could even start to understand some of the language and the complexity of this market space. So anyway, just to give you that initial focus just on payers in the US, and then you kind of go down a level from that and say, okay, so what are the common problems and the common challenges that they're facing? And I suppose the first thing I want to point out here is that there is some overlap with health systems and with life sciences, but not a lot, and they tend to be a whole separate set of challenges that they're facing. And in some cases, they're actually directly opposed challenges to the health system. So these are the kind of key strategic areas. And the reason I'm kind of calling these out here is if you're thinking about going after that market, then here are some of the hot buttons or the hot topics that have kind of come out. So you can see them for yourselves there. But this is the sort of some of the strategic areas that are we heard as we went and talked to many of these folks in terms of how they're working with digital health companies and entrepreneurs. I mean, if you just look at the two graphs there, you can see, this fairly significant growth, both in terms of investments, not as much on the M&A sides, but very significantly in terms of the partnerships. And we would argue that that's good, but it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the opportunity. And so we've just called out there. I'm happy to share these, but you can call out some of the more interesting transactions that we can maybe talk about Livongo in a little bit later, because that's obviously quite a hot topic. So moving in then to sort of a little bit more of the detail behind that, just focusing in on kind of where are they investing and how are they partnering. I suppose the first thing to say is, of the ones that are investing, just a little over 50% of them are actually investing in some strategic way. So I think we see a lot of people dabbling in kind of pilot projects or whatever. So a little over 50% are investing in some strategic way. But if you look down to this, so half of them are investing strategically, but it's still taking 6 months to kick off a project. So from the point of where you've gone through all the hard work of getting in the door, kind of explaining, getting your champion, etc., to actually from that point to actually moving on is 6 months. So it's hard for any early stage company to kind of wait 6 months while they're going through a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy. So you can see the kind of breakout there. Sorry, Grace, I realize I've been talking for quite a long time, and happy to pause there for a second. I was kind of losing the run of myself.
Well, I think it's really interesting though, because for Australian companies or any companies to be able to see those key areas you just shared, it's a great clue for which areas are actually of interest for people to address. And knowing that it's going to take 6 months, I mean, we hear that there's long pilot cycles and stuff, but you guys actually have the data to show that it's, what's going on now in this sort of COVID time as well. So I think that's really important. A few questions have come through though, so I may as well tuck into one of them. I mean, you mentioned that there's healthcare is, thousands of billion-dollar markets. And so do you have any distinction, or are you able to elaborate between digital health companies that are trying to do efficiency gains, i.e. like this digital health that are unregulated, say, and then digital health that are trying to do direct health outcomes, like digital therapeutics, as kind of two separate, do you guys see them as two separate markets, or how do you deal with those two? Because they've got different opportunities around them.
I would argue that you have to do both. I don't think you can just do one, so I don't think it's sufficient to say, I've got a great, cure for X. I think, there's only so many resources in the world, and it doesn't matter, like, if you got the most amazing therapy, if you can't demonstrate, especially to payers, right? We're having this conversation with some investors the other day, unless you can convince the payers that they're going to save their money typically in a year, because they have a very, I would say, probably pragmatic but old-fashioned view of, like, if your renewal is up in a year, then I invest in you, and then you go off somewhere else, then I've lost it. So we don't necessarily break them into those different categories, Grace. I think we would argue that that anything that has, you can't just be one, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's fair advice. Do you have an example up your sleeve of an EU company that's gone into the US successfully, and any tips or how they went about penetrating the US market from the EU?
Yeah, so there's a couple. One is a company called Big Health. I don't know if you've come across them or not, but they have a product called Sleepio, which they started. They started in the UK, but then they quickly moved the headquarters to San Francisco. But they still have a fairly, I would call them an English company, although I think that they'd have most of their operations in the US now. So they have been very successful in terms of getting clinical data, and also getting reimbursed and figuring out that model. And the other thing that's interesting about this, if you look at some of the figures, is that a lot of these companies that appear to be instant success have been around for 10, sometimes 15 years. So I think that's a good example. I was talking to Silver Cloud the other day. They're a mental health company, and what's interesting now is you start to see these blurring of the lines. So they would be very much focused on kind of depression and behavioral health, and they've been very successful kind of penetrating the US market, going after the health systems. And that was a lot of that was the CEO deciding to move himself and his family to Boston, and to get on he was getting on a plane every week, kind of going around the US to visit clients. So and he's kind of been successful. He'd be a good guy to get to speak, because he's been very successful in the NHS as well, which is a completely different market, and he kind of figured out to crack that. But I think the message I keep hearing is, and it sounds a bit trite, but first of all, show me the money, and how are you going to save money? Because there isn't pools there to go and invest in this stuff. And then secondly, show me the clinical data and show me the evidence, and so and show me the evidence not in Australia or in the UK or in Ireland, but in the US. So that can make it a little bit more of a challenge.
And then, unsurprisingly, you said he was successful in NHS. So what about coming the other way? So how is the NHS post-COVID and also post-Brexit in terms of accepting international companies into it?
Yeah, well, maybe can I pause on that one for a second? I'll go through I've got a couple
of
slides.
What's coming up, so
yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So I'll just wrap up this section. I'll come back to that. So in terms of outcomes and impact, so this is interesting. Only 2/3 actually have KPIs. So there's a third there who've been investing without any KPIs, which is interesting. And then of those, there's only 44% who are able to show positive outcomes, right? So even though they're kind of playing around this space, they're still finding it hard to. And what I think this is, what we find is there's a lot of innovators within these large organizations who are trying to convince their colleagues, and so that's a big challenge. So that's 2 more slides just on this, and I'll come on to the NHS in a second. In terms of culture and leadership, interestingly, 9 out of 10 have an executive leader who's responsible for their digital strategy, whereas a while ago, I don't have the data, but I would argue that those roles didn't really exist. So there is somebody now at a senior level who has responsibility for this, which I think is pretty good. And then 2/3 are saying that the culture, I would think that just feels a little bit more ambitious than the reality of it, but the 2/3 are saying that they have an open culture. So I guess that's positive news. And then last one on the US payers, 75%, which I think is pretty good, have a dedicated budget for this stuff. So there is a person, which is good news. There is a budget, which is good news. They probably, at a high level, the KPIs and showing the value is still a challenge. But here's the interesting thing: this 38% believe that they have the internal support, right? So that it would still seem like, okay, we're going in the right direction. There's more happening, but these leaders within these payers still have a huge job getting the rest of their organization on board, and that's probably going to be a barrier, I would say, to getting scale. So that was just a quick outline of that. You asked me about the NHS, Grace. So maybe I'll just start kind of at the EU level and then kind of go down into the NHS. I guess the first thing to say is this is a lovely map. Everybody's focused on Brexit, so it's very hard. That's just kind of continues, that and COVID just continue to dominate. And as the UK starts to come out, there's certainly a lot of confusion going on. And again, it's very hard to get time with anybody because, there's COVID and then there's this. So if you're trying to get into the NHS, that's a huge challenge. let me do this back to front then, if that's okay, because I'll come back to this slide because I think that probably makes more sense. There's a brilliant video which I'll send the link on. It's literally 6 minutes from the King's Fund, which explains the NHS. And I don't know how much work they put into this, but it's phenomenal. So I'll share it with you. I don't want to bore everyone.
Please, I'll pass it on to the team here, the audience.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Have a guess how many people work for the NHS?
God, 20,000?
1.4 million.
That was such a terrible guess.
Like, just think of the size of that, right? 1.4, a budget of about 100 billion, right? So, okay, within that, then there's 200, and this video will go into a lot more detail. There's 200 what they call clinical commissioning groups. So these are groups who can buy services. They can buy them from what they call the trusts, or they can buy them from the private sector, right? So then you kind of dive into that a little bit more. They have set up what they call these vanguard sites. So one of the big trusts within some of the reform that's going on is what they call these vanguard sites, which is really about trying to look at care more holistically and look at kind of joined up care and outside of the acute. And so that's been a major push, which I think is a great move in the right direction. And then they've set up what they call these STPs, Sustainability Transformation Partnerships, which are working with the local authorities and the kind of charities, and just kind of thinking about health as a ecosystem, not just like an amazing hospital. And they set up these partnership structures, and in some ways kind of akin to the accountable care systems that we saw in the US. So to answer your question directly, I personally and our team have really struggled to kind of navigate around the NHS, because it's just, that's 1.4 million staff, right? Anecdotally, the best example was the one I mentioned earlier, which is Silver Cloud, which was very interesting, as the CEO, Ken, moved from Ireland to the US because he was focusing on that, and then all of a sudden the NHS started to take off, and so he spent all his time flying back over to the UK. And he would provide a good insight, but in effect, I think what he'd tell you is that, it was really going around those 200 individual commissioning groups and kind of going one by one, that, I didn't see that there was that kind of pattern. I also very surprised because there seems to be a real focus on local organizations, just that mindset of, looking for British companies. And I know the Australian system is probably a lot closer than others to the UK, but certainly a lot of the people we talk to always kind of think the first thing is to think about is there a British company that can do this? And so, if you think about health, if you think about digital health, it's a very busy market, so I talked it right at the start. All this money going in means all these companies being formed. And then one of the challenges of that is, okay, it's great that there's money, but one of the challenges is how can you show that you're different? And how can you show you're different and better than some of the local folks who, culturally are probably closer, and they, they're down the road or whatever. So think about that, right? A busy doctor, fighting with busy healthcare system, fighting with COVID, with Brexit going on, all these companies flying around. You're going to have to really stand out to say, like, what is it that you're doing that's better than the local companies and is going to save them money and do them better jobs? So,
and would you say that their risk appetite is lower, in that they just can't afford to make a mistake and get slammed for choosing a foreign company unless there was just the safest bet in the world? Is that coming into?
I think that's a good point. And I think, if you look at what's happened with Google, I mean, they really got slammed. The media, because the NHS, that's another dynamic that is very interesting, is that it's, it's a publicly funded system. And so there is also this kind of skepticism about working with the private sector, and people don't talk about that much, but I think that's true. And you see the press really going after Google and DeepMind for, what happened there. So, yeah. And, coming back there are some companies, but very few, who've really started to scale in Europe, and I guess Cry are kind of the main one. But this is some analysis work we did. It's probably about a year out of date, but I don't think it's changed that much, to be honest. And so if you look at these major markets, they're really the only one that's kind of got penetration. Starting in Sweden, but then they've managed to get into Germany and UK, and more recently into France. But there's very few that we're seeing that are cracking, and there's very few that are coming the other way. So we're not seeing. I'm scratching my head to think about US companies that have figured out how to come into Europe. And I guess because their market, going back to the market being twice the size, then you probably have to have. Why would they, right? Yeah. So I know we're kind of starting to get through time. Happy to take any more questions. I just close out in the terms of presentation. I just touched on a few. I know we're kind of 35 minutes into this. What kind of shameless plug? We try and capture as much of those insights from all these lunches that we've had and all the technology we use to collect information. So this is a kind of snapshot of our platform. And one of the things we've started to do since COVID is to open it up and to put a package together for entrepreneurs. So we typically, our customers are people like Pfizer and Roche and Novartis and those big life sciences companies, but we've started to create a entrepreneur version of this so that you can get access to the lunches and also to the insights. And so you can type in a market like Germany, for example, and you get the takeaways from the lunch, you get the German regulation, that type of stuff. So that's where we are today. The good news is that it's starting to happen. Probably talked about what's happening with Livongo and Teladoc. 18 billion valuation, phenomenal. And I think it's really a kind of watershed moment in terms of where the industry is going. So I think that's the good news. But anyway, very happy to share if anybody's interested in getting access to the platform or the lunches. We're building out this new SaaS subscription model, monthly subscription model for people who want access to our data, our people, and our network.
If you could leave us, Martin, with one message, if you wish, I don't know, what would you say about a message of hope for digital health going into the next 5 years?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great industry to be in. So what COVID has taught us is that this is such an important industry. It's a huge amount of focus. Technology is only starting to scratch the surface. There's huge opportunities to make it better, absolutely huge opportunities. What we see at the moment, the feedback we have from all the lunches is there's great technology, but very few people have figured out how to bring it together into an overall solution. And that's why I think Livongo have been successful in that they have looked at it and said, how do you actually manage a chronic disease in a way that doesn't require lots of healthcare professionals, but where you know how to manage disease, and how can you use community and technology and behavioral science to do that? So they've kind of packaged that whole thing up, delivered better outcomes and cheaper. So, and now they're worth 18.5 billion, so there's a good role model. I think, entrepreneurs who do this, do it because they feel passionate. And so that's what's going to change the world. And there's a great wave. And I think what we found, we work all around the world, and it's really about finding individuals. It's not about the NHS, it's not about Novartis, it's about finding those other individuals who are willing to take risk, who you connect with. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to connect people who are passionate about it and bring them together. And so, yeah, it's hard. It's incredibly hard. You wouldn't pick this necessarily to make money, but if you believe that technology can change healthcare, then it's probably the best time in a long time to ride that wave.